To make a new composition, I'm going to go ahead and start. So we're actually not going to preload or drop in anything into our project panel. I may actually even move this over within my space so that I have a little bit more space to deal with this particular view. This will be helpful in this particular project, just the way that we're going to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new composition here. I have preloaded some of this previously, so if you want to match these settings, I will certainly wait for you to do that. I do have it set to 1920 by 1080. I have it set to square pixels, frame rate, I put it at 24. And then the duration, I have about 6 seconds. It doesn't need to be very long for this particular demo. I'm not sure that we'll even plot anything on the time, but I think this will give us an opportunity to be able to play with a little bit of the camera once we get there. 1920 by 1080, frame rate 24. I have my resolution set to half. I'll try to keep it fairly low so that my screen doesn't lag, and I have it set to about 6 seconds. So I'm gonna go ahead and click OK on that. And I'm going to assume that you're able to do that portion. So I am going to go ahead and start by making a square. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and save this first. So if I go to File and Save As, this will be so that we can just sort of like save a version of this. I'll put it into my desktop maybe. I'll organize it later. Let's call this 3D layering process. 101, 10, no, 500, no, 9,000. 9,000 sounds better. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a rectangle or a square. I'm just going to click and drag this out, and then I'm going to also hold Shift while I'm dragging to make it proportionate. This will be able to get a shape on the page. I'm going to go ahead and center this up with my Align panel. And if you'd like to do that as well, you're certainly welcome to hold Shift, use the rectangle tool, which is Q, and then put a rectangle out there, or square rather, that is by holding Shift. And I'll center this, align it to the center. I can do that center here to my composition. I have this set to composition instead of selection. Of course, there's only one layer, so there's no selection there to be able to align it to. Center align vertically and horizontally. I then want to switch over to the pan behind tool. Oh, I need to select my shape here. And so that I can center up this, this anchor point. And this is something that we are going to do a few times during this process. So I'm actually clicking and dragging on the anchor point, and then when I hold down the command button, it snaps it to the center. You can also see that it snaps it to the corners or snaps it along the line. So just try this for a second and see if you can kind of follow the dots around the arrangement of your particular square or rectangle. Please feel free to ask questions if you're not able to get this to work. This will be a very helpful process for us to be able to make a 3-dimensional object so that we can snap it into place. So again, I'm just holding down the command button. I'm clicking and dragging on this crosshair, which is our anchor point, and I'm using the pan behind or anchor point tool, which is the hotkey of it is Y to be able to do that. And let me know if there's any questions on that process there. So I do have my anchor point centered in my square. And I'm going to go ahead and then start working in the 3 dimensions to be able to do this. Now, Adobe After Effects is primarily a 2-dimensional program, but it does have some 3D options. And I'm going to show you kind of the fast, easy way to turn those on and off. I'm going to switch back to my regular selection tool and just click on once my object. Now, before we were going to the 3D layer options here under the layer menu, there's actually a faster way to do this. I think it accomplishes the same thing. And it's right here underneath your layer toggles and modes, switches and modes. And if you don't see those, if you don't see the shy guy and the motion blur and adjustment layers and those things, just go ahead and hit this toggle switches and modes button until you do. And you should notice that one of these is set to a 3-dimensional square. It looks like a 3D layer. So this will actually also allow you to turn on 3-dimensional layer. So go ahead and do that as well. Again, if you don't see it, you can hit toggle switches and modes and then just turn on that little rectangle there. Or a cube, rather. It's the same, I believe, as going to the layer menu and 3D layer. And you can tell that it's the same there because now it's checked. Yeah, cool. Now I do want to draw your attention. If you have done that, go ahead and bounce back over to my screen. I'm just going to move this panel over just a tiny bit so I can see a little bit more of this. You should see that when I turn this on and off, just watch what happens up here. There's some tools that pop up. There's a few that become not grayed out and are then activated. And there's a huge change to our anchor point. There's also a couple things that change here. We now have an indicator that tells me this is the active camera. I also have a renderer option that shows up here. Now we'll run into this and sort of change some of the features within this renderer here as well later on. But again, something that you don't normally see unless you turn on a 3D layer is to then have this sort of active camera feature. So those are there when you turn them on. Of course, you can drill down in this layer to be able to see all the different things that change within the layer as well. We have some things that change in the contents, some things that change in the transform panel, and also some things that have been added to the layer. I'm actually just going to scroll this up so we can see a little bit extra. There are now geometry options and material options. And we're going to kind of dive into these and play around with some of those today, both when we're creating our lights and also when we're editing our layers here. So there are some fun things. I think previously we'd mostly just talked about these options here under X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation, and orientation. There is a Z axis that is added to all of your transform options, and you can see that here. It's just the third one, so it's still X, Y, and then Z. The nice thing about the Z axis, of course, is that it is also visually represented onto this kind of perspective. And as you hover over these, the red one is X, I believe the green one is Y, and the blue one is Z. And so you can sort of see this visual representation of 3 dimensions on your particular viewport here. The problem with this one is you really can't see the Z axis very well. And so there's a couple different ways that we're going to sort of change our viewport settings so that we can see a little bit more. And I'm actually going to scale this down over here on the side so that I can have a little bit more of my room spaced out for my viewport. Now, one of those features that we want to get into to be able to see a little bit better in 3-dimensional space, and I think this is very common with 3D programs, Cinema 4D, or some of the other like Maya and 3D programs that are out there, is that you can have actually more than one view active at a time. And so when you see this little button here in the center of my picture plane, it's sort of the center of my viewport here where it says active camera. Right next to it, it should say 1 view. Just go ahead and change that to 2 views horizontal. And when you do that, you should be able to see this kind of 2 visual representations of your space, your 3-dimensional space. Now, right now, this one is set to top, the one that's on the left. I think it defaults to that. Yours may be similar if you did find that 2 views. And again, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a question, if you're getting lost along this process. You should be able to also see that if you click on these 2 different squares, I'm not moving my object when I do that. I'm actually just clicking in sort of this off to the side gray area of my composition to be able to show that you can select the different camera views, the different views that are available to you under this 2 views. And they're signified essentially with just this kind of blue corner. And when I do that, it makes it easier for us to see within the space. If you can tell this one says top right now, go ahead and click on that one once first to select it. Again, you'll be able to see these blue corners, sort of blue triangles that pop up in the corners of this to be able to arrange this space. When I click on that once, I can hit the little top feature, and right next to it where it says 2 views, it should say top now. And you can change this to custom view 1. And if you do that, you should be able to see now that this has changed to a little bit easier to see perspective, sort of a 3/4 perspective of your X, Y, and Z space. So now we can actually see space here. You can also click on your object. When you click on your object, you can select it here in the layer. You can click on the object with your selection tool. It will select it in all of those places all at once. You're actually interacting with it from just multiple perspectives. Now we do want to kind of drill down and take a look at some of these contents here. Let's go ahead and change or close transform for now. If you want to open up geometry options, we'll take a look at some of these. Now, before we do that, let's actually make some copies and we'll make a box here. So I'm going to do this in a couple different ways. I think the way to do this, let's go in and make a few copies of this layer. So I think let's copy it, Command C. Let's hit Command V 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we should have 5 copies of this layer. You shouldn't see that anything has changed when you do this yet. It's all sort of stacked on top of each other, but we'll be able to edit them a little bit differently. Now, it may be fun to sort of change the color or the settings as they are. And one way we could do that is actually up here at the top. I'll just make my panel a little bit bigger so that we can see that. Do you see here at the top, when you have one of these layers selected, you can select layer 1, for instance, where it says fill and stroke at the top of your viewport there, kind of your toolbar that's at the top of this. When you select that, if you want to turn off an outline, if yours has an outline and you would like it to not have an outline, you can click the word stroke and then set that to none, and then click OK. Again, you can click the word stroke, set it to none, and click OK, and that will turn off the outline. I'm going to change the fill color a little bit. I kind of like this green color, and I may keep them within this green color space. You know what? Maybe that one's good for the back. And what we're going to do is actually change this layer and rename it to, let's see. Let's keep this one as the back wall. So I'm going to rename this one. I'll put this as the back wall. I'm going to go ahead and select shape layer 2, and I'm going to change the color just slightly. And we'll change it to be a little bit brighter maybe. And I'm just going to the fill section where I can click on that. It was a little bit darker color there. We'll just make it a little bit brighter. And we'll click OK. And I'm going to rename this one. I think this is to be floor. So we'll rename this one to floor. So I'm just going to right click and choose rename and change it to floor. The next one will be our left wall. So I'm going to go ahead and also change the color of this one. We'll just make it a little bit more different. I'll try to do kind of a monochromatic, I don't know, greens because, and let's change this one's name to be left wall. Can anyone guess what the next one will be? It'll be right wall. You were right. And I'm going to change this color as well under fill, and we'll make this a little bit brighter yet. And I'll rename this one to right wall. And I think we need a ceiling as well, or a top. So this one I also change. It's going to be a little bit brighter still. And I will rename this one to top. So you should have sort of a back wall, floor, left wall, right wall, and top going from bottom to the topmost layer as we're putting these together. All right, let me go ahead and pause right there for a second. All right, so we do need to be able to move these around, right? So they're all sort of stacked on top of each other, which means even in our perspective, we can't see them. Now there is a way to sort of pan yourself around this space. And that's this tool right here, this orbit around tool. You can actually select that and kind of change your perspective within one of these views. And if you would, just leave the active camera alone for now. It'll be actually easier to sort of zoom in and out of space. You can use zoom to kind of zoom in. You can also use your orbit tool, which let's see, the hotkey is number 1. And you can actually use that to kind of pan yourself around this 3-dimensional space, which is pretty useful, to be honest. I'll go ahead and change my view so I can see it a little bit zoomed out again. And yeah, you want to just sort of have it at 3/4 view so that we can kind of keep track of how this is being added into the space. And again, mine is set to half right now. I can set it to full, so it renders a little bit better quality. My computer may be having a hard time keeping up. Okay, so we're going to mess around with the shapes of these functional wall pieces. Now, to be able to flip out this floor, we're going to actually drill down into the transform section. We're going to use some of the numbers in mathematics. We know that if we want something to turn correctly, we need it to turn along one of these rotation axes, probably X, to be able to flip it forward, I believe. And then we actually need it to rotate a certain degree. So if we want something to lay flat, that's going to be a 90-degree turn. So we could put 90 degrees. However, as you can tell, that this kind of like intersects that object. And we actually need to make sure that we move the anchor point first before we do that. So I'm going to hit Command Z to go back until I have returned it to its 0. And what I'm going to do is actually select that layer. I'm going to select the pan behind tool again to be able to move the anchor point, and then click and drag on the anchor point and drag it down to the center of this while also holding down the command button when I get close to that center point. Now this will make it a lot easier for us to flatten it in sort of 90 degrees to be able to put it down. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my transform feature again. I'll go back to the X rotation and hit 90. And now I do have this kind of box created. So this is a system where we have to sort of start working a little bit more mathematically. A lot of the times I'm changing, settings within these kind of blue numbers on the layer itself, and then just double checking that it worked out in the way that we wanted it to look with my orbit tool. So again, we went to X rotation, we moved the anchor point down to the center, locking it in place with a command button, and then set that to 90 degrees to be able to fully turn it. Let's go up to the next section, which is the left wall. We want to be able to move this one onto the left side so that we can also flip that as well. So I'm going to select my pan behind tool once again. I will move it over by dragging, hold down the command button so that it snaps into place. If it wants to snap for me. There we go. And again, centered on that piece. And I believe the axis we want to rotate on this one now is Y. So I'm going to go to the Y axis and then type in the degree rotation, 90. And there we go. We were able to get it to rotate 90 degrees. And the color palette seems to be working just fine. I might have to darken this colored box maybe a little bit, but it's fine for now. And you can kind of see it now in three-dimensional space, I think. Feel free to rotate yourself around under the custom view 1 section. Again, it will be easier if you leave active camera alone. All right, so that we can see that perspective now, I'll go ahead and switch back to my selection tool. I'm going to go back up next to the right wall now. We need to move this anchor point over to the right to be able to get it to correctly line up. I'm going to switch to my pan behind tool, make sure I have the right wall layer selected. I will click and drag on the anchor point and then hold down the command button to get it as close as I can to that locking position. Now, I think we also want this to rotate on the Y axis, but we actually want it to rotate the other direction. Let me show you why. Get it? Why? Because of the Y axis? Unintentional pen. Okay, so I rotated at 90 degrees, but look what happens. It actually rotates, I believe, clockwise when you go that direction. So as you can tell, this is actually rotating away from the center of the box where I actually want it to go. So we need to change this to negative 90 degrees, which will rotate it inward towards the direction that we actually want it to be in. So now we have rotated that correctly. I set that Y-axis rotation to negative 90 so that it rotates the other direction and looks pretty good. So now we're going to go to the top of our wall here. And again, we need to move this orientation of our anchor point to the top center. And I'm actually, it seems like I'm having to reselect my anchor point more than once and then hold down the command button kind of right away to get it to snap. So I'm actually having to move it up, then let go, click and drag while holding the command button to get it to snap there. I hope that's working for you all. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and go into the transform section. I believe this one is going to be a Z-axis rotation because we want it to rotate forward in space. Z, as you can tell, is the direction that goes forward and backward in depth. That's very confusing because it just depends on your angle of the camera, but it is consistent throughout this space as we put it together. So I'm going to go ahead and hit 90 degrees on my Z-axis. Whoops, that was not right. Let's try that again. Is it negative 90? Or is it X maybe? See, it might be, try that again, negative 90. No. Let's try Y. No. Try X.
I use
there we go.
90 on X.
X, thank you. Easy to get confused, I will say. Try it till it works. Okay, now we have a completed box, except for the space for us to see inside of it. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, 90 in X. All right, cool. So I'll pause the video right there. Let me see if you are doing okay. All right. So as we continue on this, there is an opportunity for us to add some type, which will actually give us a little bit more stuff to play around with. So I'm going to go ahead and type a type box into the center on my active camera using the type tool. And I'll try to do some bold font, I think, something heavy so it's easier to see. So I will just create some font here. Let's type in the word space. I'm kind of messing around with the settings in this underneath my character window. So I'll increase the size of this font. I might get the kerning a little bit tighter because I had it spaced out before. I kind of want to just get some type in this space so that it's easier to see within the box. That's my goal. I'm going to change this to like a white colored lettering so it's easier to see in that space as well. I think that's about where I want it for now. You should see that you've added a kind of space. I've typed in space. You can type in something different if you like. Shortish word would be better. You can see that you've added a type layer to your options here, which is pretty cool. Now you may also notice that it doesn't show up in your custom view 1. And the reason being is that this actually makes it so that you have to also turn on the 3D layer anytime that you want a 3D layer to participate in the 3-dimensional space. So I have my space and my sizing here set to about 180. You can set yours something similar if you like. Again, the problem with this is that it is not turned on in the 3D layer. So we actually go on to the 3D layer section and go ahead and hit that button to turn it on. And what it does is it actually moves it back to the 0, 0 location, which is the same location that all of our boxes started in when we turned on the 3D layer for them. So you should see that that also makes your type layer disappear, and we need to move it forward in Z space, which is this setting here. So if we move it forward, we should be able to see it now. Now, again, apparently moving it forward means I need to move it in a negative number to be able to get it in that space, which is fine. And I'm also trying to find a space where I can make sure that it's actually like inside the box, like on the inside of it. So if you can get it to fit inside the box, that's kind of the ideal situation. I think I've got a little bit of that lettering that's poking out the side, so I might shrink it just a tiny bit so it's not as large. Maybe 150 would be better instead of 180. Yeah, so now it's actually in that 3-dimensional box within my space here. Let me zoom in a little bit closer. There needs to be a zoom level between 50 and 100, I think. Change it. Does everybody get that okay? So we've got our lettering in there. What's neat about this is still, even though it's a 3D layer, this is still live type. This is something that you can actually animate using the type animators, some of the things that we've gone over previously. So if you wanted to use this as an animation tool within 3-dimensional space, it can be done that way. Now we can also drill down into the geometry options to be able to make it sort of 3-dimensional. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up real quick, and then let me know if you guys also do that. If you've got your lettering sort of spaced in the box, if you're able to get it in the box, that's great. Does anyone have the kind of bevel depth, hole bevel depth, extrusion options? Is any of this geometry options grayed out for you?
Yeah, mine's grayed out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great for me too.
Yeah, there are a couple options that we need to change to be able to activate these, and this should be available to you just with the standard edition of After Effects. When you have 3D layers turned on, one of the things that turned on was also this option here that says renderer. So it's actually in kind of the top right-hand corner of your viewport. And if you can see, there should be an option to change this. So if you click on where it says what it says for your renderer, if yours says Classic 3D, see if you have an option to change it to Cinema 4D. When you click on that, it should open up composition settings. If anyone doesn't see this option to change the renderer in the top right-hand corner of your viewport, you can also go to composition and composition settings. So there are options there as well. When you go to composition settings, it's like the same box that we're used to seeing when you start creating your composition. You can see it under basic as a tab here, advanced, and then also 3D renderer. And then just change that to Cinema 4D and click OK. Let's see, those of you that had that option grayed out, you should be able to interact with it now. Very good. Did that work for you? Yes. Popular technology to be able to have that, that feature. So we're actually going to mess around with the extrusion and bevel depth. This is things that we can kind of mess around with. So I'm going to try and put myself into a particular view so that I can see these letters as they expand in space. So I'm going to try and move into the letters themselves, and I'm going to try and kind of get into a perspective here so that I can see what's going on and see if that helps anyway. And my screen just does not want to render, does it? I'm going to increase my bevel depth here. And also my extrude depth. And maybe the extrude depth is one that we can actually set to about 80 here. 85 maybe. And you should see that that's actually adding some to the letter, if this would ever like render here. That's annoying. Is it any better for any of you? It's my Zoom situation.
Mine's working.
Okay, all right, very good. Well, that's fine, as long as it works for you. All right. So you should be able to see, or I would be able to see if this was working correctly, that the depth of the letter has actually expanded. Part of the problem is that it just looks like it's grown in its white space. So one of the problems with this is that you can't see a lot of change in the dimension of the letter without actually adding lighting. So one of the things that we're used to seeing when you have a beveled letter is actually light and shadow, so that there's highlight on some space and lights on some other spaces as well. That creates shadows on some of the sort of edges of the letter. If you create something that's like kind of a mock-up of three-dimensional space with a two-dimensional thing, you can sort of change the color of those side pieces when you create that beveled edge. That's something that I think is sort of something we're used to using in our kind of two-dimensional space. But we need to set up a light for this to be able to function correctly. So it's kind of totally flat. It's like not three-dimensional yet. There's no contrast, and we need to set up lights. So we're going to do that if we go up to our composition layer. Let's see, layer menu, new, and then choose light. And I'll do that one more time. Layer, new, and light. And this should be able to set up a space for us so that we can actually see kind of what we're working with. There's a couple different types of lights. Most of the time when you're setting this up and kind of messing around with it, you may need more than one light source. And you can kind of think about it in the same way that you might have to set a stage, in the same way that you're kind of like able to move camera around the stage within kind of a theater setting. You need to have certain kinds of lights to be able to get certain kinds of shots. So a spotlight is a fairly common one to start with. An ambient light is one that's a little bit less useful in that we can't move it around a lot of times once it's set, but actually being able to have multiple kinds of lights and then set up a few different ones to be able to properly light a scene is something that you might have to kind of play around with and do. But let's just play around with the spotlight for now. You don't need to change any of these settings because they can all be changed after you've already set the light, and the color of white is fine. So I'll just set up spotlight 1, it's perfectly fine, and go ahead and click OK. So that will add a new layer in our scene. And I don't know why my computer doesn't want to render. That's kind of frustrating. Let me pause for a second. Okay, so we've gotten one to work. I'm not sure what the issue is. I will go ahead and delete this light and we can just remake that light setting space there. So actually, if you just sort of select your topmost layer, we want this on top. I'm going to go ahead and go to my see layer, new, and then choose light. And so far, it was actually none of the settings that we have changed beyond that. So far, we're going to add in a spotlight. We're going to add in kind of, we'll change some of these settings as we go through to kind of see how they change your version. And if you don't mind, you may have to double check your version. For some reason, mine does not want to render today. And you can go ahead and click OK. And that will create a sort of light in your space. Now, if you can tell, and I'm going to try and move around in this space here and leave this one alone, because for some reason it seems like it's rendering at least the active camera. When I zoom in and out of this, you should be able to see that there actually is a physical, almost looking object. It's got a visual representation of the space that it's casting light in. I will zoom out a little bit further. Can you all see that on my sort of perspective view a little bit? I'm sorry, it was jumping there for a second. You should see that it also has an anchor point where this camera exists. There's kind of a circle to denote the space where it is casting light, and then there is a directional lines to show you how that connects to the circle. So when you're moving around in the space, you should be able to see that there's kind of a visual representation of how this camera is casting light in the space. I'm sorry, the light is casting light in the space, not the camera. And this is something that I think we can actually put into kind of the space of the box to be able to show that this layer is a little bit more three-dimensional than it was previously. So again, I'll try to zoom in on this space again. Maybe someday it'll render. You should see that the light that it's casting on this particular feature here is very like flat. It's almost like it's just lighting the front face of it. Maybe there's some grain or tone to it, but we can actually change a lot of those settings underneath the light settings. I believe the hotkey to open up the light settings is AA. So if you double tap the letter A, we'll be able to open up the light options. It's the same thing as if you kind of drill down and skip over transform and go to lights options. So you can see a lot of those settings that were available to us when we went to the layer new and light setting was also things that we can change from down here. And actually there's some more options as well. We can change the intensity and the color. We can change the sort of cone angle. And when you change this, you should be able to see that it changes on your screen as well. And you can narrow that cone angle. Just try that just temporarily to sort of see how that changes the effect on your screen. You can increase that space as well to sort of light it a little bit more drastically. You can have cone feather, which if you wanted to, you can turn this up very, very high to get very, very soft edges. If you want to turn this all the way to 0, it's going to give you something that's much more of like a graphic light, something that's sort of like hard contrast between white and or highlights and shadows. So there's quite a lot of opportunity to sort of choose stylistically how you want this to interact with each other. I'm just going to put this at back to 50 because it's perfectly fine for the demo for that. And you can also see that it's actually casting a little bit of light on the background of our space as well. And if you do pan around this within this box, you may be able to see that it's casting just a little bit of light on the edges as it goes that far. What you'll notice is that there isn't a shadow that's being cast through the three-dimensional letters, right? So like the space, the word is not casting a shadow onto the back of the box. And that is something that we can do. And you can actually do that if you change some of these fall off radius distances and turn on cast shadows. So if we want this to be kind of smooth, we can set that. The radius is here. You can change those settings as well. The fall off distance, it'll give you as before the light starts not casting in depth space. Right now, our light is very, very close to our object and we've kind of stopped it from going anywhere within the box. So you may not see much difference when you change those numbers. The one we want to kind of play around with today is turning on cast shadows. And when you turn it on here on the light, you'll notice nothing happens again. We actually have to accept shadows underneath some of the material options on the letters themselves. So we're going to go back to our type layer. I'm going to go down to our material options. And there is an option here where it also says cast shadows, and we're going to turn that on. And then we get the feature of where that cast shadow actually becomes part of our scene. And again, sorry, my scene is just not wanting to render for some reason. There must be a setting that I have turned down or something. I don't remember doing that, but I will find it for later. Just go ahead and emoji if it looks like it's working for you, and I'll pause there for our Zoom recording. All right, awesome. Thank you so much for the suggestions on fixing that. Appreciate it very much. And yes, we can sort of change some of our light settings, which I didn't get to sort of see very well last time. You can sort of see as that changes and gives you a little bit more of a detailed view. I'll kind of zoom in on my space here. We have shadows set up now so that as we move our camera or potentially move our light around, I'm sorry, camera, I keep saying camera. So we move our light around or change its space or settings, those shadows may also alter or change. You can give different radius, the shadows. You can shadow darkness, you can change as well. So if you want to soften them, that's something that you're going to then change on the light. So once you've turned on the material settings so that the lettering of space actually accepts shadows and will cast them, you can go back to the light and turn down the shadow darkness. You can also diffuse the shadows in some ways. This is going to add a little bit of a texture to them. It's sort of as if, as you know, the way that light functions from science class is it is a wave as much as it is a particle. So it not only can bend around corners, which then gives you this kind of fuzzy view on the edges, but it also bounces around within the space so that it actually will kind of cast ambient light as it bounces around. So again, another reason you get these kind of soft corners. So I have this one set up to, I don't know, 5, 10, 15, 30, something to be able to get this just a little soft edge to your shadow, which is kind of nice. And we'll be able to cast this on that space. It's pretty fun to play around with. And it's also all of these things that you can animate over time. As you can tell, all of these things are stopwatches. So if you wanted to sort of spotlight something in a scene and be able to render it from this active camera view, we can add a camera and then be able to do one of these kind of like, you know, light reveals of your space and change that light to sort of then do this kind of like nice casting, if that makes sense, of your light. So, I mean, these are options that you can do things with to be able to add transitions, to be able to add interesting effects to the scenes. That's pretty fun. Okay. There's also a few different options that we can change in things on our material options in the letters themselves. So if we want to change, for instance, under material options on the type layer, I can go in here and sort of change how these accept light indifferently. If we want to make it so that there's a little bit less ambient light, we can diffuse the light a little bit more. How it appears on reflections, we can turn those on. You can also, again, I don't know why this makes sense, but you can make something look more reflective if you turn down the metal feature. I'm not really sure why that is, but it'll start to have a little bit more of kind of a little bit more of like a sheen to it, I think, which is kind of neat. See if I can zoom in here. Shade it around so we can see some of the bevel. You can also change some of the bevel options. So reflection intensity and sharpness and reflection roll off will also give us just a little bit more fine tune in the way that this behaves within the light. So play around with those settings, see if you can see how they're changing that space just a tiny bit. And the specular intensity is actually giving me a little bit of a harsher light in the center. You can also change under the geometry options the kind of bevel that you want it to have. So if you want it to have a little bit more of a rounded edge, you can choose convex or concave, which will give you a little bit different view of these letter forms, which is kind of interesting. So play around with those too. You can get quite a lot of character out of it. There is also an option for us to move our light now with the transform options. It's very straight on with our letter form and the way that it sort of starts casting that light. It may be something where we can move it back away from Z space so that it backs up away from it a little bit and then point it up into a different direction. So if you can tell, there's an option under our spotlight where it changes its point of interest. Do you see this little tiny anchor point that's in the center of this? That's actually the point of interest where you can kind of change the direction of your light. So it sort of casts a point out into space, and then you can move that in a direction that you'd like it to be at to sort of cast light differently. So I'm actually going to change its position on the Y axis to get it to go up a little bit higher so that it's casting my shadow down a little bit lower. And you should see now you can actually see a little bit of the kind of angular space of our bevel that's a little bit different color there. And then I'll try to put my point of interest back on kind of our subject, which is the lettering. Yeah, maybe I'll cast this up a little bit higher. Yeah, and I think if you hover over the port view, you can switch to the tilde button to be able to get a little bit more of a kind of sense of the scene. And thank you again for helping me fix my full render issue, which was quite debilitating for this process. Kind of cool. All right, let me pause right there. How are you all doing? Okay, so there's quite a lot you can do with this, and hopefully you're seeing some of the ability and sort of opportunity within the space. I think you can pair it with many of the different features that we've started to animate things with, kind of like this, you know, top angle camera view, or excuse me, light view of what we're seeing here that's casting on this. And again, if you want to make copies of these, If I move one over, so send it all the way on the x-axis over to one side, it's going to kind of light your scene a little bit differently. I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this spotlight so that I have two. So Command C, Command V on that layer. You can see now it's giving me much more of a kind of reflected surface view of this light, being able to stack them differently. I can also move this one over to the other side. So in the same way that you might create stage lighting, oops, I'm sorry, I moved my point of interest. I want to move my x-axis over to the other side of the scene. Now we have this kind of like multiple views of this object that's casting shadows in a little bit different way. So now you can see a little bit more of the information of that bevel. Zoom out here. So within our cast light shadow box, those lights are casting light onto the edges of that box. And we're able to set up different lights. I will show you also, I believe this works this way. When I change the spotlight to an ambient light, I sort of lose some of my transform options. I'm not sure why that is. What was happening the other day? Yeah, so I do not have the option to choose kind of the settings. And I believe the idea of an ambient light is sort of that it just casts light out rather than in a spotlight, it's casting it in a particular direction. It'd be sort of like taking the hood or light cover off of a light that's just in a room. It's just going to cast light all around itself in every direction. So I believe this is the function of this. I think even changing ambient light colors, there's a cool opportunity here to be able to create some sort of like neon light scenes and things so that that light is then something that you can sort of cast around. And you can see now it's kind of lighting that in a little bit different way. Again, I don't know, I'm just playing with greens today for some reason. But there's some really nice features that I think you can do with this to be able to get different color changes within your scene. And again, the color of the light really changes the color of the scene. Of course, I can change the color of the type, but I don't know that that really affects the bevel informationally in the color of the background space. So you can create some really beautiful compositions this way, I think. Opportunity to use type involved as well, but just as much as any three-dimensional object can also have geometry options and material options as well. So if you wanted to create some 3D objects, you could certainly do that also, which I think would pair fairly well with this particular project. All right, so let's talk about adding a camera. And let me zoom out of here so that we can see a little bit more space here. I'll just leave that ambient light up for now, kind of like that green light being cast. Kind of diffused quite a lot of my spotlight effect, though. Some of those shadows were fun. I don't know, up to you, however you want to choose how you want to light your scene. Get a little bit more shadow in there. All right. So I'm going to go up to my layer and new, and now choose camera. There's a couple different options that pops up when you do that. Again, let me hit cancel. It's under the layer option, new and camera. You don't have to know a ton of what's going on here. It's just giving you actually like physical realism out of the actual kind of camera that you want to choose. I don't know a ton about video cameras to be able to tell you more about this. But I would suggest that if you choose a 1-node camera versus a 2-node camera, choose the 2. It just gives you a little bit more options within the details of kind of the drill down menus within this. Camera 1's perfectly fine for the name. You could change the name if you want to, but just choose the 2-node camera if it's not already on that, and then click OK, and that will add a camera in your space. Now, what's interesting within this, and again, we have not changed a whole lot of our active camera view yet. The active camera setting is actually the camera itself. And now I'm panning around in my custom view. Let me zoom out so we can actually see where that camera is actually wherever your active camera is supposed to be aligned. Oops, it's kind of jumping me around here. There we go. So can we see where that camera is on my screen here? So this is the camera. It's actually not a part of the picture plane, but it's actually floating in this 3-dimensional space out to the side here. And that is our perspective. It's also showing us the edges of this particular view here. If I were to move my camera, which I can do that by moving, again, the position, point of interest, the image rotation, any of those things. Let me just zoom in Z space here to be able to get my camera view to change. So as I zoom in here, it's the same as if I was zooming within my screen to be able to set up that sort of camera view. So I'm getting closer to my object here, and you can see that that camera is moving closer to that object within this field of view space. I could go up a little bit if I wanted to rotate it around. The position is changing around the point of interest. So when I'm using my y-axis, it's kind of leaning forward and backwards, and left and right. So see if you're able to get that to work as well. It's pretty cool. It's maybe a little disorienting, potentially, unless you're like used to Minecraft and stuff, and then you're good with three-dimensional space. All right, I'll pause right there. So within our space, we're able to kind of create this interplay between lights and space, 3 dimensions, and a camera. One suggestion that I think is very good is that some of the time you want to be able to move your camera around independently from the positions of the camera itself. So for instance, if I'm also kind of angularly moving the camera this direction to be able to get different viewpoints when I set up my scene to be able to animate kind of my camera view around it. And subtle camera views are perfectly fine this way, but there's also an option to be able to set up a null object as part of something that you can use to move the camera around in 3-dimensional space. So if you use the camera to do very fine-tuned movements where you're just changing a little bit of the perspective of that, sort of if you think about it on like, you know, how you might sit on a swivel chair or something, and where you can kind of rotate around the chair without moving the wheels at all. If you then kind of right click on this and choose camera, there's also a create an orbit null. So creating an orbit null will create a null object that you can then use to move the camera around. And that would be essentially actually sliding around on your kind of swivel chair to be able to move around in the space. It's easier to be able to do that in 2 different versions or 2 different objects, 2 different layers to be able to move that in that space. It helps quite a lot to be able to do those into 2 different pieces. So if I were to actually physically move this, and as you can tell, it automatically sets up a parent to the camera so that the parent is the camera 1 orbit null. So that when I move this null around, that will move the camera, but then I can also key up through the keyframes some of the different settings to be able to actually specifically place the camera's point of view where I want it. So now you can see I'm kind of moving that null object around space, and that might be a better way to sort of limit your controls from one or the other. So if I want to zoom in here, I might zoom in into the box if I can get it to line up so that it does do that. And of course, I could cue that up into space as well. So we're kind of doing this zoom thing. So even if this is the position where I want it to start, and if I go a few seconds forward, and then I want it to sort of zoom in. So that goes through that perspective there. You can sort of see that it's going to do that motion with the null object. If I then also wanted to change its persistent view of the camera itself, you can also change the transformation. In this case, I might leave position alone and just do the orientation here. So I can sort of also change it. Oops, put that back to 0. And at the same time, we'll kind of like zoom around. So we're kind of like flying through, if that makes sense. Let me just do 4. Who wants to render this? Maybe. Oh, there you go. It would render right. Just doesn't want to preview render, which is fine. So now we kind of have this feeling that from our active camera view that we're kind of like going through in 3-dimensional space. Of course, you need sound effects, right? Some explosions, some lasers, some spaceship lasers. Okay. We'll go ahead and pause the recording there.